So, I'm not entirely sure how I was convinced to cover this section, but I am going to regale you with tales of governance and audit. Oh yes, sit back and enjoy. But you know what? It might not be the most glamorous or exciting part of a sedation, but it's absolutely critical to establish and maintain the safety of patients who are undergoing procedural sedation. And as we've previously discussed, sedation not without its complications, with issues like the cardiovascular effects of the agents we use, the fact that we're blunting the patient's physiology and potentially their airway reflexes, and that patients can respond unpredictably to our dosing strategies. So this potential for adversity means that we really should be operating within a well-governed system which puts processes and procedures in place to minimise those risks, and one which regularly audits its practice to ensure that safe and effective working practices are being upheld. So that's all well and good, but what is governance? Well, you asked the question, and if you really want to know, then it's a framework through which NHS organisations are accountable for continuously improving the quality of their services and safeguarding high standards of care by creating an environment in which excellence in clinical care will flourish. Whew, well, if that doesn't leave you feeling inspired, then nothing will. But in short, any organisation offering sedation should have robust governance frameworks in place for the procedure. In fact, it's so important that the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges recommends establishing a sedation committee within an institution. It's their job to lead on key issues surrounding sedation practice. Some of those things might be development and review of local guidelines, the review of reported clinical incidents where sedation's a factor. It might be annual audit of the numbers of sedation cases and the incidence of complications within the institution, or it might be the overview of staff training and continuing personal development in sedation practice. And these suggested duties might extend further. In smaller teams where sedation might be less commonplace, such as in pre-hospital critical care, often every sedation that's undertaken is reviewed as part of their governance processes. And this really helps to ensure that guidelines are being adhered to and adverse events are not going unreported or unrecognised. Now, one aspect of good clinical governance mentioned in that list is regular audit. And RCEM, the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, states that all sedation practice should be audited and individual emergency departments should develop audit standards and markers by which they are measured. Now, whilst that allows flexibility and individualised markers for different departments, a more standardised approach, certainly involving some core elements for audit, would allow us to compare departments and organisations and give us an appreciation of where each group's individual performance lies. And I think rather than being seen as a conduit to creating a league table for sedation performance, actually that should be seen and embraced as an opportunity to improve performance. And with that in mind, the Academy of Royal Colleges suggests several auditable criteria, which include the number of procedures performed by each operator, unplanned admissions and operations within 8 days of a procedure, 30-day mortality, the use of reversal agents, the need for ventilation, and a sustained drop in oxygen saturations below 90%. Now, an audit clearly relies upon good documentation. In fact, it's absolutely fundamental to it. And we've already touched on the importance of comprehensive and contemporaneous clinical records when we're undertaking the procedural sedation. But we all have different thresholds for thoroughness when it comes to documentation. So I think it's probably worth reviewing what the guidance says. So NICE recommends that as an absolute minimum, the pre-sedation assessment of the patient, informed consent, and the values from the continuous patient monitoring should all be recorded in the patient record. Now, RCEM adds to this and suggests that any deviation from the planned level of sedation, whether that's intentional or unintentional, should be recorded. And if you remember, when it comes to sedating a child with ketamine, that ASA grade should be formally documented, along with an accurate weight that you use to undertake your dose calculations. Now, all that might seem like quite a lot to remember when you're supposed to be just focusing on the patient and providing a safe and effective sedation. That's why often a pro forma is used. And these can not only standardise the recording of a sedation, which improves reporting and audit, but it also acts as a checklist prior to undertaking the procedure. That's a total win all round. So worth investigating with your organisation whether they have one of these pro formas for sedation. But collecting data and comparing it against standards is only really part of the audit cycle. And as part of good governance processes, the outcomes of these audits need to be reviewed, and issues or worrying trends need to be identified, and new measures need to be put in place to address them. And in this way, the incidence of adverse events should be reduced and the quality of procedural sedations improved, making it a safer and more satisfactory experience for patients and practitioners alike. But so far we've discussed governance and audit from an organisational perspective, but there's also a responsibility on the individual to maintain and demonstrate their competence and currency in the procedure. And as part of that process, some organisations require their clinicians to maintain a sedation log, which can be reviewed on an annual basis, or actually the clinician may simply just want to keep track of their sedations as part of their own advanced practice log and help them to identify any areas for development or some focus for their future studies. Now, the contents of this log might be determined by the individual, or again, a pro forma might be provided for you by the organisation if they're the ones that are enforcing the maintenance of a log. And if you're creating your own log, then some of the points to document might include things like the indication for the sedation, the patient's weight and the calculated drug dosages, whether or not you used a checklist, the oxygen use, and any complications that you encountered. Now, alongside those audit processes, organisations should all have incident reporting systems in place, and I'm sure we all know and love the DATEX system. But it's got a very important role to play in governance and audit of sedation in particular, because prior to formal audits, which might only occur on an annual basis, DATEX submissions can help to identify early trends in clinical incidents. And the clinical incidents that are recommended to be reported surrounding sedation by the Academy of Royal Colleges are similar to their auditable standards. So things like the use of flumazenil and naloxone, a sustained drop in oxygen saturations below 90%, unplanned instrumentation of the airway or intervention of an anaesthetist or other airway expert, and finally, unplanned admission to hospital following a procedure under sedation. Now, there's also a never event relating to sedation, which we should definitely be aware of. Now, if you've not come across these before, never events are defined as serious incidents that are wholly preventable because guidance or safety recommendations that provide strong systemic protective barriers are available at a national level and should have been implemented by all healthcare providers. So if these events occur, they're absolutely mandatory to report, and that's because the occurrence of a never event might highlight potential weaknesses in how the organisation has managed the fundamental safety processes that are supposed to be put into place to avoid these situations. In relation to sedation, an overdose of midazolam due to selection of a higher strength preparation instead of the 1 mg per ml preparation represents a never event. So, if this section serves to achieve nothing else, always check your midazolam concentration before you draw it up and give your sedation. But there's finally one last thing to consider, and I think as you'll be gathering by now as we come towards the end of this course, sedation is a bit of an art form and it's not a strict science, and that introduces wide variation in sedation practices, and that increases the need for us to record and track adverse events. And as part of an international approach to this, the World Society for Intravenous Anesthesia and their International Sedation Task Force, that's a mouthful, has developed an event reporting tool for sedation-related adverse events. And this tool is available either as a web page through several organisations and can be easily found through an internet search. But even if you don't report your adverse events through their website, they've got a really handy checklist which could be incorporated into your institution's monitoring practices or as an addition to your own sedation logbook. So in summary then, organisations in which sedation is undertaken have got an obligation to put into place good governance processes to maintain and develop the safety and the efficacy of sedation practice. And that should be underpinned by the creation of a sedation committee who lead on key issues surrounding the governance of sedation. Part of that will be a robust audit cycle to monitor and improve practice alongside regular review of the guidelines and clinical incidents involving sedation. And don't forget, the individual clinician may want to or be expected to maintain their own sedation log to monitor performance, demonstrate competency and currency, and help to identify areas for development.